One of my favorite movies is Sixth Sense. I don't know how many of you have seen this movie. It was, I think, in the early 2000s and late 90s that the movie came out. But this movie perfectly illustrates the question that we started off the consideration of miracles with. And that's the question of, are miracles as external influences into nature really interferences and patches and therefore signs of imperfection in God? Or are miracles the thing, the tie that binds nature into a higher harmony? And Lewis has been arguing that it all depends on what the story is about, right? That a real miracle is one that will illuminate and integrate the whole story and therefore be that missing piece that shows us what the picture of nature, what life in nature is really about. And this is what I love about Sixth Sense. Is imagine you watch Sixth Sense, and Sixth Sense is a movie about ghosts. It's a movie about this young child, this young boy who is able to see dead people. So thus the famous line you might have heard, "I see dead people." That's his sixth sense. And in his ability to see dead people, he is traumatized and he's thought of as weird by other people because he can see things that others can't see. And so there's thought to be this psychological condition. Now, the real main character of the story, though, is the psychologist that treats him, Malcolm. Now, Malcolm is one who, at the beginning of the story, is going to receive this award for his work with traumatized youth and his ability to show and produce real health, psychological healthy change in their lives. And so he's just come back from receiving this award with his beautiful wife, and just as he puts the award down, she kind of lets him know that, look, I'm not first in your life. Your profession, your practice has always been first. And then they discover someone in the bathroom, a young man who, when he was a child, was treated by Malcolm, but he was unsuccessful. And this young man has a gun, shoots Malcolm and shoots himself, commits suicide. And Malcolm is now on the bed with a bullet wound in his stomach, and the hospital is called, the ambulance comes, and everything shifts now to about a year later, where he meets this young child. And this young child has the exact same symptoms that the person he failed did. And now he sees himself as the only way to redeem himself is to help this child get out of his delusions. But what does he come to discover? He comes to discover that the child is right, that he does see dead people. And so once he realizes that this child has a sixth sense that reaches into the other realm, he is able to then help the child see this as a gift and not a curse, and to use his communication with the dead to help the living. And so thus this child is able to let, for example, a family know that the mother killed her child through Munchausen syndrome by giving the child rat poisoning to make them sick so that they could take care of the child. And the dead daughter comes back and allows the child to communicate to the father what really happened. And so the story ends. Let's say the story ends with the mother of the child realizing the son has a gift, and they hug, and they now know that everyone is okay, right? And that this child has a great gift. If the movie ended like that, it would still be a pretty good movie. And then let's say that we discover the last 10 minutes of the movie. In the last 10 minutes of the movie, we discover something about Malcolm himself. And that is this: Malcolm is dead. Ah. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal? The big deal is when he finds this out, every other part of the movie makes sense. Because a year later, what you see is you see him in an estranged relationship with his wife. He never talks to her. She's always in another room. Whenever he tries to talk, she turns. They're in a restaurant together. The bill is right in front of them. It's on their anniversary. He's late. She's sitting there alone. He sits down, she takes the bill, pays it, and leaves. She starts to see another guy. He sees them together, but he can never talk to her. And so now all of this looks like just the broken down marriage. But when you find out he's dead, then it all makes sense. In other words, Sixth Sense, the last 5 minutes tie the whole movie together so that if that was missing, you would have a movie, but it would have too many loose ends. Once you add that crucial fact that he is dead and that only the child could see him, then everything else makes sense. And therefore, if you were to find this part of the movie and wonder, is this the missing part? Even if the movie looked complete, when you added on to it, you realize, yes, this is the climactic ending that makes sense of the beginning and ties every loose portion of the movie, every character twist, every plot, what seems like a tangent, together into one single whole. And therefore you go, aha, at the end. That's why this happened. That's why he never talked to her. That is why the temperature always dropped when he was in the room. Various things like that. What is Lewis claiming? He's saying that's the test of the probability of a miracle. Is it the kind of thing that a perfect being would use to crown nature and bring her into her glory? In other words, it answers the question we had a few lectures back. Is nature a solo act? And what does the incarnation do for us? It illuminates the character of nature. It has shown us that nature on its own is like a stained glass window. Except it's a stained glass window that has been put in the basement of the church and not put so that it can be where it reflects light. So now imagine nature as a stained glass window. On its own, it's imperfect. On its own, it does not do its job. On its own, all we do is feel it and wonder why it's so bumpy and the glass so imperfect. But then what? Then the window is put up in the middle of the night. And then the sun rises. And as the sun rises, we see that what seemed like this imperfect, poorly made window indeed is a magnificent work of art. One that when the eternal light of God shines through it, illuminates the nature of the work. By itself, nature is imperfect. Why? Because nature wasn't meant to be alone. A stained glass window wasn't meant to be alone. Without the light shining through the stained glass window, there is no work of art. There is no true function. So what has the incarnation done for us? The incarnation is like the sun that has shed light through nature so that nature on its own, this dark and imperfect, rough thing, becomes now the supreme window into the nature of God. We now know through the incarnation that these four basic essential characteristics of nature, really when the window is shined through, when the sun of eternal light shines through it, is the perfect portrait of God, the infinite in the finite. And what does it show us? It shows us that God is love. And love is a relationship. And therefore, nature and God are like dancers. They're a duet. On their own, when you see only one, nature by herself, she is like the dancer that jumps up and is ready to be caught, but there's no one to catch her. Only with God as the dancer, as the lead dancer, can nature come into her own in perfection. And so therefore, what does the incarnation do? It takes what is imperfect, dark, and mysterious, and through shining through it, shows us the true picture of God as love. and therefore the true nature of life itself. Life in nature is meant to be the image of the supreme good. What is that supreme good? God. What is God? That has always been the mystery, right? Even in Boethius, God is great, God is good. But what is good? Good is love. And so, we therefore love because God first loved us. And this then clues us into why nature, you might say, is imperfect, and why there's so much death and cruelty and hatred. The Christian idea is this, is that nature's perfection is in the process of completion, right? Just like the stained glass window's perfection is not by itself, but only when God shines through it, when the light shines through the stained glass window. But here's the difference. We saw that the difference between love and a loving relationship between a beloved and a lover is willingness. And so the difference between a master and a slave and a lover and beloved is one is forced, the other is willing. Both involve service, both involve submission, both involve power. But here the power is stolen. Here the power is given. Here the power is used to destroy. Here the power is used to empower. And so, on the one hand, what Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and the Buddha have told us is entirely correct, Lewis would say. They're looking at the window in the dark. And what are they going to see? They're going to see either life as suffering, waste, and absurdity, and therefore needs to be escaped. This vicious cycle of striving that's never fulfilled on its own, because it is this striving for an object that's never there. It's a window without light. Or it's the will to power, right? It's this striving and domination in order to get what can never be gotten. And so both Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and the Buddha are right, but they're right only from the perspective of seeing the window without the light and not knowing what the window is for. And therefore, a window without light is absurd, isn't it? It's meaningless. And thus Schopenhauer is right. But then what happens in the Incarnation is that the light shines through, and that same thing now becomes perfected. What on its own is absurd now becomes supremely beautiful and meaningful and worth it. This is what the Incarnation has done. It's illuminated the true nature of nature. But you notice, it has got to be through willing completion, willing communion. Nature cannot be completed forcefully. If it were, it would be slave again. And what is the mind of nature? When you look at the picture of creation given to you in the Bible, Lewis says this, just like Carl Sagan, that human beings and all rational beings are the mind of nature, are the part of nature that makes nature a living being, a being that can say yes or no. And thus, in creating humans, God has created a being that cannot be forced. And therefore, the process needs to be one that is completed, cannot be on its own, and therefore nature must be imperfect by herself. But nature cannot be perfected if nature is not willing. And the Christian claim is that what humans have done is rebelled against God, has said they do not want God's love. And if God is truly love, as lover, he cannot force her. He must allow nature, in the mind of nature, human beings, to be able to go off on their own, to be able to reject the light from shining through the window, and therefore what? Lose its purpose, lose its portrait, and therefore lose all of its significance. Therefore, what we have in the Incarnation is the key to nature's perfection and imperfection. We have the answer to why it seems absurd, but on the other hand, we have the answer as to why it seems like such a great work of art as if it is wasted. It's a tragedy. And what makes a tragedy, a great tragedy, is that what you have is something that is great and wonderful smashed to the ground and wasted. Without the greatness, there is no tragedy. Without the suffering, there is no tragedy. And what the incarnation reveals of nature is that that tragedy is not irreparable. The incarnation, therefore, both redeems nature and shows what nature was truly meant to be, what the true meaning of life is. And thus, as Lewis puts it, in studying nature, it's as if we discovered the notes on the margin of the poem, but without the poem itself. In the incarnation, we have the poem, and now we see what the notes were about.